My son sold my late wife's grand piano to take his wife to Paris. The music shop owner called me. The space where Eleanor's precious guitar once stood was empty. It wasn't just an instrument, it was the spirit of his dead wife. Arthur's trembling hand dialed his son, Leo's number. Leo, where's your mother's guitar? His voice trembled. From a noisy Manhattan office, Leo's voice rang out impatiently. I sold it. It's nothing. Arthur's voice cracked. Sold? What are you talking about? It's your mother's spirit. A weary sigh. Dad, listen. Chloe needs money to go to Paris for her brand. That guitar is just gathering dust. Be realistic. Forget it. I have a meeting. The phone hung up coldly, leaving Arthur alone in a silence heavier than death. I guess 99% of you will hear this. Sigh and scroll past. Not clicking like or subscribe, even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you, and where are you listening? The morning ritual was an anchor in the quiet sea of Arthur's days. The 7 a.m. Light slanted across the kitchen, illuminating the familiar comfort of the gleaming espresso machine, a sleek, stainless steel beast he and Eleanor had splurged on after a trip to Milan. He measured the dark, oily beans from a local roaster, the whir of the grinder the first sound to break the profound silence of the house. It was a silence he had learned to live with, a thick blanket that had settled over every room, every piece of furniture, since Eleanor's passing 2 years ago. He tamped the grounds, locked the portafilter into place, and watched as the rich, syrupy espresso began to drip into the small ceramic cup. The aroma, a mix of bitter chocolate and roasted nuts, filled the air. It was a scent of normalcy, of routine. He took his cup to the bay window, overlooking Cold Spring Harbor. The water was a placid sheet of silver under the pale morning sky, the sailboats bobbing gently at their moorings like sleeping birds. This view had been Eleanor's favorite. She used to say it was a living painting, never the same twice. For Arthur, the peace it offered was now layered with a persistent, bittersweet nostalgia. He could almost hear the faint, melodic strains of her guitar, the intricate finger-picking of a Bach piece that was her morning meditation. But today the silence felt different. It wasn't the familiar, gentle quiet of an empty house. It was a deeper, more absolute stillness, as if the very air had been vacuumed of all resonance, all memory. The phantom notes of Eleanor's guitar refused to materialize in his mind. There was no echo. A subtle ripple of unease disturbed the calm surface of his morning. The house felt too quiet, unnervingly so. He found himself walking away from the kitchen, his bare feet padding softly on the cool oak floors. He moved down the hallway, past the gallery of photos chronicling a life. Eleanor, radiant in a white sundress on a beach in the Outer Banks. A much younger Arthur, trying to look serious in his first law firm portrait, and a family picture with Leo, a teenager with a rebellious smirk, already looking eager to escape the frame. His steps were slow, drawn by an invisible thread of dread toward the music room at the end of the hall. The door was closed. He turned the old brass knob, the click echoing in the unnerving quiet. The room was bathed in morning light, dust motes dancing in the sunbeams that poured through the large windows. The scent of old paper and the faint, sweet smell of the boxwood from the garden lingered in the air. Her music stand stood in the corner, a half-finished score still clipped to it. The antique armchair where she would sit for hours, lost in her craft, was there. Everything was as it should be, except for the gaping void against the far wall. The space where Eleanor's cherished Martin guitar had rested on its velvet-lined stand was empty. It wasn't just an empty space. It was a wound in the room, a sudden, shocking amputation. The sunlight fell on the patch of wall, revealing a slightly lighter shade of paint where the guitar's silhouette had protected it from the fading rays of countless afternoons. Arthur's breath hitched. A cold dread, sharp and swift, pierced through him. This wasn't a burglary. The silver candlesticks on the mantelpiece were untouched. The small, valuable paintings on the walls were still in place. This was something else entirely, something personal. His hand, trembling slightly, reached for his phone. He scrolled to Leo's name, his thumb hovering over the call button. He pictured his son in his natural habitat, a corner office in a midtown Manhattan skyscraper, encased in glass and steel, 40 stories above the relentless hum of the city. Even before the call connected, Arthur could hear the soundtrack to Leo's life, The distant, urgent wail of an ambulance on Fifth Avenue, the incessant, polite chime of office phones, the low murmur of a world that ran on transactions and ambition. "Dad?" Leo's voice was sharp, impatient. He sounded like he'd been interrupted in the middle of something far more important. Arthur swallowed, trying to force the words out past the lump in his throat. His voice was a raw, trembling whisper. "Leo, where's your mother's guitar? Her guitar?" There was a brief pause, a crackle of static that seemed to span the vast distance between their two worlds. Then came a sigh, heavy with the weary exasperation of a man who had no time for such trivialities. "I sold it, no problem." The words didn't compute. They were alien, nonsensical. "Sell it? What are you saying? It's Eleanor's." Dad, listen." Leo's voice took on a condescendingly reasonable tone, as if explaining a complex market trend to a child. "Chloe wants to go to Paris. It's an important trip for her brand. The guitar is just sitting there collecting dust. It's time to get real. You should too." The unspoken accusation hung in the air, that Arthur's grief, his attachment to the past, was a liability. "I have to go to a meeting." "Leo, that guitar was everything to her," Arthur pleaded, his voice cracking. "It was her soul." A harsh, dismissive sound, something between a scoff and a groan, came through the phone. "Dad, it was a piece of wood and wire. An asset. Chloe's influencer career is taking off, and these trips are investments. We're talking about our future. You're talking about a memory." There was a rustle of papers, a muffled voice in the background. Leo was already moving on. "Look, I'm in the middle of a deal. Just get over it." The click was abrupt, cold, and final. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was heavier, more suffocating than before. "Get over it." The two words echoed in the empty room, a brutal dismissal of a life, of a love, of a legacy. It wasn't just about the money, or Chloe's brand. Arthur knew his son. Leo was drowning in a world that measured a man's worth by his net income, and he was terrified of failing by its standards. The pressure to maintain Chloe's lavish lifestyle, to project an image of effortless success, had clearly become a desperate, corrosive force. But that desperation didn't soften the cruelty. It only sharpened its edges. Arthur looked at the faint mark on the oak floor where the guitar stand had stood for all those years. The mark was more than a physical impression. It was symbolic of a void in his soul, a void he realized had existed long before the guitar had disappeared. He had been living passively with his grief, a custodian of memories. Now he felt attacked, erased. This is not a spontaneous act. This is an erasure. Hours bled into one another. Arthur sat in the antique armchair in the music room, the one Eleanor used to occupy, and stared at the empty space against the wall. The initial, searing shock of Leo's phone call had subsided, leaving behind a cold, heavy paralysis. It felt as if the house, the harbor, the entire world had been muted. He was adrift in a silence so profound it was a physical weight on his chest. His mind replayed memories in a torturous loop. He saw Eleanor, her head bent in concentration, her fingers dancing over the fretboard of her Martin guitar. He remembered the day she brought it home, her eyes shining with a reverence he usually only saw when she looked at their newborn son. He remembered the smell of lemon oil as she meticulously polished the aged spruce top, the way she would talk to the instrument as if it were a living thing, a confidant. "You've got stories to tell, don't you, old girl?" she would murmur. The guitar wasn't just a possession. It was an extension of her, a vessel for her joy, her sorrow, her very soul. And Leo had sold it, like a piece of used furniture. Get over it. The words were a fresh wound with every recollection. The sudden shrill ring of his phone was a violent intrusion. It shattered the stillness, making him jump. He fumbled for it on the small table beside him, his movements stiff and clumsy. An unknown number. Area code 212. Manhattan. A fresh wave of dread washed over him. It was Leo, calling back to rationalize, to justify, perhaps to lecture him further on the impracticality of sentiment. He didn't have the strength for it. He stared at the screen, letting it ring, his thumb hovering over the decline button. But on the fifth ring, some other instinct took over. He answered. "Hello?" His voice was a dry rasp. The voice on the other end was not Leo's. It was low and gentle, with the faint, gravelly undertone of a lifelong New Yorker. "Is this Mr. Arthur Finch?" Yes. Who is this? Mr. Finch, my name is Sam Roth. I own Roth's Vintage Instruments down on Bleecker Street. There was a pause, as if the man was choosing his next words with great care. In the background, Arthur could hear the soft, melodic noodling of an acoustic guitar, a sound so alien and yet so achingly familiar. Your son, Leo, he was in my shop this morning. He brought in your wife's Martin. Arthur gripped the phone, his knuckles turning white. He couldn't speak. He could barely breathe. Sam seemed to understand his silence. He continued, his voice laced with an empathy that felt like a lifeline. The kid seemed in a hurry, looked like he hadn't slept, said he needed cash right away. A lot of it. Another pause. Mr. Finch, I've been in this business for 40 years. I know this guitar. Eleanor, your wife, she used to come in all the time. Bought her strings here, special polish from Germany. We'd talk for hours. She loved this instrument more than anything. Oh, the mention of her name, spoken with such familiar warmth by a stranger, cracked something open in Arthur's frozen grief. I asked your son if he understood its real value, Sam said, his voice dropping lower. Not the price tag, you understand. The history, the soul of it. He just shrugged at me, sir. Said, it's just an old piece of furniture. Hearing Leo's callousness reflected back by a third party was somehow more devastating. It was a confirmation of the deep, chilling chasm that had opened up in his family. I'm so sorry to be the one to tell you this, Sam said. I bought it, of course. I had to. I couldn't let it just disappear onto the market. But that's not the only reason I'm calling. He hesitated, and the suspense crackled over the line. Sir, I've known Eleanor for years. She told me once, Sam, if anything ever happens to me, and this guitar comes through your door under strange circumstances, you call Arthur. She made me promise. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. A promise? There's more, Sam said, his voice urgent now. After your son left, I was giving the guitar a proper look. Over Eleanor, she left something inside. Tucked away deep in the body, in a place no one would ever think to look unless they knew. Sir, you need to come right away. The paralysis that had held Arthur captive for hours shattered. A current hot and electric shot through him. He stood up, the phone still pressed to his ear. For the first time since he'd opened the door to the music room, a feeling other than despair took hold, a sharp, dizzying surge of purpose. He wasn't just a victim of his son's betrayal anymore. He was a participant in something else, a mystery his wife had set in motion long ago. He grabbed his car keys from the hook by the door, his movements suddenly sharp and decisive. The long drive into the city, a journey he usually dreaded, now seemed like a pilgrimage. He was no longer drifting. He had a destination. Arthur hung up after getting the address and looked at the framed photograph of Eleanor on the mantelpiece. She was on the beach in Montauk, laughing into the camera, the wind whipping through her hair. But now, her smile seemed different. There was a secret in her eyes, a glimmer of the playful, ingenious woman he had loved for 40 years. Eleanor was always one step ahead of him. Always. And perhaps, even after she was gone, she still was. The drive into the city was a jarring transition from one reality to another. The tranquil, tree-lined roads of Long Island gave way to the relentless concrete artery of the expressway. Arthur drove on autopilot, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, the world outside his windshield, a blur of brake lights and impersonal steel. The city loomed ahead, a fortress of glass and ambition, its chaotic energy a stark contrast to the crushing silence he had just escaped. He was a pilgrim on a desperate journey, heading into the heart of the world that had swallowed his son, armed only with a stranger's promise. Roth's Vintage Instruments was an oasis on the bustling sidewalk of Bleecker Street. A small, unassuming storefront with gold lettering on the glass, it felt like a portal to another era. The moment Arthur stepped inside, the city's cacophony was replaced by the hushed reverence of a library and the rich, woody scent of aged instruments. Guitars of every shape and vintage lined the walls like sleeping sentinels. In the center of the room, on a velvet-draped stand, was Eleanor's Martin. It was like seeing a ghost. Arthur approached it slowly, his heart aching. The warm amber hue of the aged spruce top, the intricate mother-of-pearl inlay around the sound hole, the small, familiar nick on the headstock where a young Leo had once bumped it with a toy truck. He reached out a trembling hand and ran his fingers along the strings. They were silent, but he could feel the ghost of 1,000 songs humming beneath his touch. A wave of such profound love and loss washed over him that his knees felt weak. Sam Roth, a man with kind, weary eyes and a gentle demeanor, emerged from a back room. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the sacredness of the moment. "She's a special one," he said softly. "Eleanor kept her in perfect condition." After a few moments, Sam gestured toward the guitar. "She showed me this once, years ago, made me promise I'd never forget." With the care of a surgeon, he laid the instrument on a felt-covered workbench. He pressed a finger on the 6th fret, then slid it down to the 12th, and then, in a move Arthur would never have discovered, he applied a firm, upward pressure on the small, decorative heel cap at the base of the neck. There was a soft, satisfying click, and a nearly invisible seam appeared. A small, hollow compartment was built into the body's block, a space no larger than a cigar box. "I'll give you some privacy," Sam said, tactfully retreating to his office. Arthur's breath was shallow. He carefully slid the small, handcrafted cedar box out of the opening. The scent of wood and memory filled the air. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet, was a thick manila file, a small, heavy brass key, and a cream-colored envelope with his name on it, written in Eleanor's elegant, familiar script. His hands shook as he opened the letter. "My dearest Arthur, if you are reading this, then my worst fears have come true. Forgive me for not sharing this burden with you while I was here. You were carrying so much already, but I could not leave you unprotected. I saw something in Chloe from the very beginning, a coldness, a calculation in her eyes that everyone else mistook for ambition. I started to worry, so I called my old college friend. Frank Miller, you remember him, he became a private investigator. I asked him to be discreet, to just look into her past. What he found was worse than I imagined. Everything you need is in this file. Don't let Leo's blindness or his pride destroy what we built. Be smart, be careful. This is not the woman you think she is. She is dangerous. I love you, always. Eleanor." His heart hammered against his ribs. He opened the file. The first document on top was a glossy clipping from the Palm Beach Daily News. The headline read, "Philanthropist settles lawsuit with companion." In the photo, a young woman was walking briskly out of a courthouse, her face obscured by oversized sunglasses. She wore a pristine white Chanel suit, the picture of untouchable elegance. But Arthur knew that confident posture, that defiant tilt of her chin. It was Chloe, under the name Sabrina Dubois. He read on, his horror mounting with each page. Frank Miller's reports were meticulous, detailing a pattern of behavior across 3 states. Chloe or Sabrina or Ashley or whatever name she was using would target older, wealthy, and often emotionally vulnerable men. She would embed herself in their lives, isolate them from their families, and then systematically drain their assets. The final exhibit was the most chilling. It was a transcript of a conversation Eleanor had recorded on her phone, with a small note clipped to it. "Tea at the Maidstone Club, last August." Eleanor had overheard Chloe talking to a friend, her voice a venomous whisper. "Leo is so predictable," the transcript read. "He craves his father's approval so miserably. It's almost pathetic. You just have to give him the feeling that he's making his own powerful decisions, and he'll do anything I want. Even sell the family heritage for a few pretty pictures on Instagram. The old man is sitting on a fortune, and I don't have time to wait for nature to take its course." A guttural sob escaped Arthur's throat. He collapsed into a nearby chair, the papers scattering onto the floor. The tears that came were not for the loss of the guitar. They were for Eleanor, for the terrible, lonely weight she had carried in her final months, shielding him, protecting him, even as her own body was failing her. She had been fighting a war he never even knew existed. He cried until there were no tears left, only a hollow, echoing ache. Then, slowly, a new feeling began to crystallize in the void. The grief, the pain, the betrayal, they began to cool and harden into something else, something cold, solid, and heavy. Resolve. He knelt and methodically gathered the papers, his movements no longer trembling but precise. He stacked them neatly, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He held the file in his hand, feeling its weight. These were not just pieces of paper. These were weapons. and Eleanor, his gentle, music-loving wife, had crafted them with the precision of a bomb maker. Arthur left the Bleecker Street shop with a quiet, solemn nod to Sam Roth. He walked out into the chaotic symphony of the village, but the noise no longer touched him. He was encased in a bubble of cold, silent purpose. The grief that had paralyzed him was gone, replaced by the humming efficiency of a machine that had just been switched on. He was an engineer again. He had a problem, a complex system of lies and deceit, and he was going to dismantle it piece by piece. His first stop was not home, but the Chase Bank branch in Huntington, a familiar, sterile building of polished marble and hushed transactions. He presented the small brass key to the clerk, signed the ledger with a steady hand, and was led into the vault. The air was cool and still. The safe deposit box slid out with a heavy, satisfying thud. Inside there was no money, no jewelry. It was Eleanor's final secret arsenal. There were the original, notarized copies of Frank Miller's investigation. There was a small, encrypted hard drive. And there was one last letter. This one was not emotional but tactical. A detailed breakdown of the Finch family assets, trusts, properties, offshore accounts that Eleanor suspected Chloe was systematically targeting. It was a battle plan. Arthur realized with a jolt that Eleanor hadn't just been defending her memory. She had been protecting their entire future. Back in the sanctuary of his home, he began to assemble his allies. The first call was to David Chen, the family's attorney for over 30 years. They met in David's quiet, wood-paneled office in Garden City. David, a shrewd man with sharp eyes and a perpetually skeptical expression, listened in silence as Arthur laid out the contents of the file. He read the newspaper clippings, the private investigators' reports, the transcript from the Maidstone Club. His skepticism melted away, replaced by a look of profound, angry shock. "My God, Arthur," he breathed, placing the papers down as if they were contaminated. "This is monstrous. Leo has no idea?" "He's the key to her whole operation," Arthur said, his voice devoid of emotion. "His desire for my approval is her primary tool." David steepled his fingers. "A direct confrontation is risky. She'll deny everything, paint you as a grieving, confused old man. She'll turn Leo against you completely." I have no intention of confronting her directly," Arthur said. "I'm going to let her build her own stage. We're just going to control the lighting." The second call was harder. He found the contact information for the retired businessman from the Palm Beach Daily News article, a Mr. Alistair Harrison. He initiated a video call, and a tired, dignified face appeared on his screen. Arthur explained who he was, his voice gentle but firm, and told him the story. He watched Harrison's expression shift from weary reluctance to a flicker of something long dormant, the desire for justice. "That woman, Sabrina," she called herself, Harrison said, his voice raspy with old pain. "She cost me more than money. She cost me the last years I had with my own children. They thought I'd lost my mind." "She's about to host a major charity fundraiser in Soho," Arthur said, "to cement her place in New York society. I want you to be there. As my guest." Alistair Harrison was silent for a long moment. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Tell me when and where." With his allies in place, Arthur retreated to his study. For years, this room had been dedicated to the pursuit of perfect sound, the precise calibration of acoustics, the meticulous design of speaker systems. Now he used the same skills for a different kind of engineering. He pulled up the website for the Soho Art Gallery where the fundraiser was being held. He studied floor plans, downloading architectural blueprints. He analyzed the gallery's built-in A divided by V system, noting the placement of speakers and projectors. He spent hours on the hard drive from the safe, listening to the chillingly clear audio recordings Eleanor had secretly made. He mapped out a sequence, a presentation of evidence timed to the second. He was no longer a grieving husband, he was a show producer, and he was designing the performance of Chloe's life. The final piece of the trap was the bait. He found the invitation to the fundraiser online, a gaudy affair benefiting a dubious-sounding foundation Chloe had established. He picked up the phone and dialed Leo's number. Before he pressed call, he took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and summoned the ghost of the broken man he had been just yesterday. "Leo?" he said, pitching his voice to a weak, tremulous tenor. "Dad? Is everything okay?" Leo sounded wary, braced for another confrontation. Leo, I... I'm sorry, Arthur said, letting his voice crack. I was so harsh the other day. It's just, with the guitar gone, I miss your mother so much. He let a sob catch in his throat. It sounded disgustingly authentic. On the other end, he could almost feel Leo's relief. Conflict averted. Oh, Dad, it's okay. I understand. No, it's not, Arthur insisted. I was wrong. You're building a life with Chloe, and I should be supporting you. I was thinking I'd like to make it up to you both. I want to give you a special wedding present, in person, at Chloe's party, a significant one. Something to secure your future. There was a stunned silence, then Leo's voice, filled with a mixture of surprise and greedy relief. Wow, Dad, that's great. Of course, Chloe will be so happy. Arthur hung up the phone, the act dissolving instantly. He sat in the silence of his study, his face a mask of cold resolve. On his desk lay the blueprint he had just drawn the gallery floor plan, covered in notes on audio cues, video projections, and precise timings. He had spent his life engineering the perfect sound. Now, he would use that same skill to engineer the perfect silence, the deafening, absolute silence that comes just before the storm. The Soho Art Gallery was a cathedral of modern wealth. Towering white walls were sparsely adorned with enormous abstract canvases that seemed to vibrate with chaotic color. The air, thick with expensive perfume and the low thrum of self-congratulation, buzzed with the conversations of Manhattan's elite. Men in tailored Tom Ford suits and women in glittering Chanel and Dior gowns held delicate glasses of champagne, their laughter echoing off the polished concrete floors. To Arthur, in his simple, dark suit that had served him well for 2 decades, the scene was an alien landscape. He was not a guest. He was an infiltrator, a ghost at the feast. He moved through the crowd with a calm, deliberate slowness, his eyes scanning, assessing. He saw David Chen by the bar, nursing a club soda, his sharp gaze missing nothing. In a quiet alcove, pretending to study a sculpture, stood Alistair Harrison, a man of quiet dignity, his presence a secret bomb waiting to be detonated. The pieces were in position. Then he saw them. Leo, looking handsome and proud in a bespoke tuxedo, was beaming, his arm wrapped possessively around Chloe. And Chloe was the radiant center of this universe. She wore a breathtaking evening gown of fiery red silk that clung to her like a second skin. She was a queen holding court, her smile a dazzling, practiced weapon. When she finally spotted Arthur, that smile faltered for a fraction of a second before reforming, this time with a sharp, condescending edge. She glided towards him, Leo in her wake. "Oh, you're here, Dad," she said, her voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. She looked him up and down, a faint smirk playing on her lips at his dated attire. "I told the waiter to keep an eye on you. Go ahead and get yourself a drink. Don't be shy." She spoke to him as if he were a distant, impoverished relative invited out of a grim sense of duty, a charity case at her own charity event. Leo, oblivious, just smiled, relieved. "Glad you could make it, Dad." Arthur simply nodded. "I wouldn't miss it. It's a very important night." An hour later, the jazz trio on the small stage finished their set to polite applause. Chloe tapped a glass with her fingernail, a gesture to claim the room's attention. But before she could speak, Arthur was already moving. He walked past her, up the 2 short steps, and stood at the microphone. A confused silence fell over the gallery. Chloe's smile froze, a rictus of disbelief. Arthur looked out at the sea of expectant, curious faces. His heart was a steady, cold drum. He was an engineer, and this was a calibration. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm and clear, amplified perfectly by the gallery's state-of-the-art sound system, a system he, as a small sponsor, had insisted on helping to calibrate earlier that afternoon. "My name is Arthur Finch, and the gift I want to give my son and my daughter-in-law tonight is a story." He paused, letting the tension build. "It's a story about ambition and reinvention, about a very talented woman." Behind him, the massive screen that had been projecting the Foundation's logo flickered. An image appeared, the newspaper clipping from the Palm Beach Daily News. A photograph of a woman in a white Chanel suit, her face half hidden by sunglasses, leaving a courthouse. The headline was stark and clear. The name Sabrina Dubois was legible to everyone in the first 10 rows. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Chloe went pale, her hand flying to her throat. What is this? What kind of sick joke? Before she could finish, Arthur cued the next phase. The gallery was suddenly filled with the sound of Chloe's own voice, captured in perfect fidelity, venomous and clear. Leo is so predictable. He craves his father's approval so miserably. The old man is sitting on a fortune, and I don't have time to wait for nature to take its course. The recording was a bomb that detonated in the pristine silence. Leo flinched as if he'd been physically struck. He stared at Chloe, his face a mask of horrified disbelief. The crowd erupted into a cacophony of gasps and frantic whispers. Chloe lunged for the stage. "He's lying. This is insane. That's not me." "Isn't it?" Arthur's voice cut through the chaos. He gestured to the back of the room where a preset spotlight flared to life, illuminating the face of Alistair Harrison. "Perhaps you'd prefer to be called Sabrina. Mr. Harrison here remembers you quite well." It was over. The facade had not just cracked. It had been atomized. The room descended into chaos. Guests backed away from Chloe as if she were contagious. Her lawyer was suddenly at her side, trying to steer her away, while David Chen was already speaking quietly with gallery security. In the ensuing pandemonium, Chloe was no longer an elegant socialite but a cornered animal, her face contorted with rage and panic as she was swiftly escorted out a side door. The party was in ruins. Champagne glasses lay shattered on the floor. The abstract paintings now seemed to mock the very real, very ugly human drama that had unfolded beneath them. In the center of it all, Leo stood frozen, a statue in the wreckage. His face was ashen, his eyes vacant. He had lost his wife, his social standing, and the entire foundation of his reality in the space of 3 minutes. Arthur walked off the stage and approached him, his steps heavy. He did not reach out to comfort his son. He was not a father in that moment. He was the executor of a final, painful truth. He stopped a few feet from Leo, the chasm between them wider than the ruined gallery. "Here's your gift, Leo," Arthur said, his voice low and devoid of warmth. "It's the truth. Now learn to live with it." He turned and walked away, not looking back, leaving his son to the ashes of the life he had so eagerly chosen. The Long Island Expressway was a river of red and white lights, flowing away from the city. Arthur drove in the far right lane. The steady, monotonous rhythm of the road, a stark contrast to the chaotic implosion he had just orchestrated. Manhattan, a glittering, indifferent beast in his rearview mirror, finally faded into the darkness. He had expected to feel something satisfaction, vindication, even a grim sense of triumph. Instead, there was only a vast and profound emptiness. The adrenaline had drained away, leaving a residue of bone-deep weariness. He had won, but it felt exactly like losing. He pulled into his driveway, the crunch of gravel the only sound in the deep suburban quiet. Inside, the house was a tomb of silence. He didn't turn on the lights, navigating the familiar darkness by memory until he reached the music room. It was here that the wound had been opened, and it was here he returned, as if to a gravesite. The moonlight cast a pale, sterile rectangle on the floor where Eleanor's guitar used to stand, the faint mark on the oak a permanent scar. The silence in the room was no longer the gentle, nostalgic quiet he had grown accustomed to. It was a heavy, accusing presence. He had vanquished the dragon, but in doing so, had burned down the entire kingdom. The next morning the phone rang, jarring him from a shallow, dreamless sleep. It was David Chen. "Arthur, news travels faster than wildfire," his attorney said, his voice crisp and dry, stripped of all emotion. The New York Post ran a story on page 6. They're calling Chloe the Soho scammer. It's brutal. They got their hands on the Palm Beach story, and Alistair Harrison gave them a quote. Arthur said nothing, picturing the bold, merciless headline. "The authorities in Florida and Connecticut are already involved," David continued. "With Frank Miller's file and Alistair's testimony, they have more than enough. Chloe's assets, and all joint accounts with Leo, have been frozen pending a full investigation. She's not going anywhere." There was a pause. "But that's not the worst of it. They mentioned Leo's firm by name. His partners are in full panic mode. He's been suspended indefinitely." David relayed the story he'd heard from a contact at the firm. Leo's boss, a man who preached loyalty and aggression in equal measure, had called him into his glass-walled office overlooking the city. "You're a PR liability, Leo," he had said, his voice cold as the chrome on his desk. "We can't risk the company's reputation because of your family mess. Clean out your desk." Later that afternoon, his own phone rang. The caller ID simply said, "Leo." Arthur hesitated, then answered, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. "Dad?" The voice was unrecognizable. The sharp, impatient confidence that had defined his son was gone, replaced by a raw, broken whisper. He sounded like a lost child. "Dad, I've lost everything," Leo stammered, his words punctuated by ragged breaths. "The firm, my accounts are frozen. Chloe, she's gone. Her lawyers won't let me speak to her. The landlord is evicting me from the apartment." He choked on a sob. "I don't know what to do. I'm at a hotel. I used the last of my cash for one night. Can you help me?" Arthur closed his eyes. The plea was everything he had once, in some secret fatherly part of his heart, yearned to hear. His son, stripped of his arrogance, turning to him for help. But he knew with a certainty that was as painful as a surgeon's knife what he had to do. He thought of Eleanor, of her quiet strength, of her fierce, protective love that had extended beyond the grave. "If I help him now," he thought, "he will never learn. He will find another Chloe, another easy path. I lost Eleanor. I cannot lose my son's soul too." A long, heavy silence stretched between them, filled with the static of a ruined life. "No, Leo," Arthur said finally, his voice quiet but unyielding. The word hung in the air, a final, brutal judgment. "You made the choices. You ignored every warning. You sold your mother's soul for a fantasy. You brought this on yourself. Now, it's time you learn how to clean up your own mess." He hung up the phone before Leo could respond, his hand trembling as he placed it back on the receiver. Arthur sat in the music room, staring at the faint mark on the floor, the ghost of the guitar. He realized with a chilling clarity that revenge had not filled the void. It had only hollowed it out further, making the silence heavier, more absolute. Justice had been served, but peace had not yet come. Perhaps the real enemy was never Chloe. Perhaps the real enemy was the wreckage she left behind, and the terrible, lonely task of learning to live among the fragments. I guess 99% of you will hear this, sigh and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second, what time is it for you and where are you listening? The weeks that followed were a study in silence. Arthur's decision to cut Leo off replayed in his mind, a merciless loop of his own cold, final words. The initial, hard certainty of his choice began to erode under the daily assault of loneliness, leaving behind a tormenting question. Had he done the right thing, or had he simply authored the final chapter of his son's destruction? He moved through the empty house like a groundskeeper of memories, pulling weeds in Eleanor's garden with a ferocious, punishing energy, polishing silver that already gleamed, organizing bookshelves that were already in perfect order. Each task was a small act of penance, a way to fill the hours and fend off the crushing weight of the silence. David Chen called occasionally, his voice a dispassionate link to the world Arthur had detonated. He delivered updates like a stock ticker report, clinical and brief. Chloe's legal battles were escalating, a multi-state affair of seized assets and pending indictments. Arthur would listen, murmur a thank you, and feel nothing. It was the news about Leo that he both craved and dreaded. He sold the Brooklyn Heights penthouse, David reported one Tuesday afternoon. Took a significant loss, but he did it fast. The Porsche is gone, too. Arthur remained silent, picturing the sleek, arrogant machine his son had loved so much. He's moved into a small rental in Astoria, Queens. David continued, a note of surprise in his voice. And Arthur, he's working. A friend of a friend saw him. He's with a moving company. The image was so incongruous, so utterly alien, that Arthur couldn't immediately process it. Leo, his Leo, who measured the world in basis points and leveraged buyouts, who wouldn't carry his own luggage from a car to a hotel lobby, was now carrying other people's furniture for a living. Arthur offered no comment, but after he hung up, a strange and unfamiliar emotion began to stir beneath the surface of his grief, a profound, unsettling curiosity. A week later, he found himself driving over the Throgs Neck Bridge, a spy in his own son's life. He parked his modest sedan on a side street in Astoria, feeling conspicuous and foolish. He waited for nearly an hour before he saw it. A large branded moving truck lumbering down the street. It pulled up in front of a brownstone, and Leo hopped out of the passenger side. He was unrecognizable. The tailored suit was replaced by worn jeans and a sweat-stained t-shirt. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by the weary, focused movements of someone engaged in hard, physical labor. Arthur watched, hidden from a block away, as Leo and another man expertly maneuvered a heavy, antique wardrobe down a narrow stoop. He saw the strain in his son's shoulders, the grim determination on his face. He wasn't complaining or posturing, he was just working. It was a picture of consequence, of a man starting from absolute zero, and for the first time in months, a faint, fragile flicker of hope pierced through Arthur's despair. The image stayed with him on the drive home. It prompted him to do something he hadn't yet had the strength for. He drove to Bleecker Street. The bell above the door of Roth's Vintage Instruments chimed softly. "Arthur," Sam said, his smile warm and knowing. "I'd like to buy her back, Sam," Arthur said quietly. He wrote a check, and the guitar was officially his again. But he didn't take it with him. "I'll leave it here for now, if that's all right. The house, it isn't ready for music yet." It became his new ritual. Twice a week he would drive into the city, not as a pilgrim to a site of pain, but as a quiet caretaker. He would sit in Sam's back room with the Martin laid gently across his lap. He didn't play it, he cleaned it, with the same lemon oil and soft cloths Eleanor had used. He checked the humidity, tightened the tuning pegs, and ran his fingers over the silent strings. It was a meditative act, a way of reconnecting not just with Eleanor's memory, but with the part of himself that had been lost in the storm. He was rebuilding his soul, one careful, loving gesture at a time, just as his son, miles away, was rebuilding a life, one heavy box at a time. One cool afternoon in late autumn, an envelope arrived in the mail. It was a plain, standard business envelope, with Leo's new Queen's address in the corner. There was no letter inside, only a cashier's check and a small folded note. The check was made out to Arthur Finch for the exact amount that Sam Roth had paid Leo for the guitar. The note contained only 3 words, written in Leo's once bold, now humbled script. First step. Arthur stood in his quiet kitchen, the check in his hand. He did not feel the surge of joy or relief he might have expected. Instead, he felt a new kind of weight settle upon him. It was the burden of a beginning. Redemption was not a destination one arrived at, but a long, arduous road. He wasn't sure if either of them, father or son, possessed the strength to walk it to the end. The diner meeting was not a cure, but a diagnosis. It laid the wound open, cleaned it of the poison of deceit and resentment, but the careful, tender work of healing had yet to begin. Weeks passed. The check Arthur had returned sat on Leo's dresser in his small Queens apartment, a constant, silent reminder of both his failure and his father's faith. Arthur, back in Cold Spring Harbor, continued his quiet routines, but a subtle shift had occurred. The house felt less like a mausoleum and more like a space simply waiting. The silence was less about absence and more about anticipation. One crisp Saturday morning, with the autumn light streaming into the music room, Arthur took Eleanor's Martin from its stand. He ran his thumb over the strings and for the first time since her death played a chord. It was a simple G major, but the sound that filled the room was rich, resonant, and alive. It was the sound of a possibility. He picked up his phone and called his son. "It's time," Arthur said, his voice gentle but firm. "Come home." Leo's arrival was tentative. He parked his used Honda Civic, a car he'd bought with his first few paychecks from the moving company behind his father's sedan, and walked up the familiar stone path as if he were a trespasser. He looked thinner, his face etched with a weariness that had replaced the soft arrogance of his former life. The expensive haircut was gone, and his hands, which Arthur noticed immediately, were the calloused, capable hands of a man who worked. Arthur opened the door before Leo could knock. They stood for a moment in the entryway, 2 strangers in a home they had once shared, the air thick with the ghosts of unspoken apologies and years of misunderstanding. "Hi, Dad," Leo said, his voice barely a whisper. Arthur just nodded and gestured for him to come inside. He didn't lead him to the kitchen for coffee or the living room for stilted conversation. He led him down the hall, his own heart pounding with a nervous hope, to the open door of the music room. The Martin guitar was back on its stand, gleaming in the sunlight as if it had never left. Leo stopped in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. He stared at the instrument, and Arthur could see the war of emotions on his face. Shame, reverence, a deep and profound sadness. It was no longer an asset, a number on a ledger. It was his mother's soul, standing right there in front of him, a silent witness to his betrayal. Arthur walked over to the guitar, picked it up, and sat in the old armchair. He didn't say a word. He simply began to play. It wasn't a complex piece by Bach or a mournful sonata. It was a simple three-chord progression, the first one Eleanor had ever taught a 5-year-old Leo on his child-sized keyboard, G, C, D. Over and over, a gentle, questioning melody. He looked at the grand piano that had sat dormant for 2 years, its keys shrouded in a thin layer of dust. He glanced at Leo and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod towards the bench. Leo hesitated, fear and inadequacy clouding his eyes. "Dad, I haven't played in years, I'm not—" Arthur didn't stop the simple progression, G, C, D. It was an invitation, not a command. Come back, find your way back. Slowly, as if in a trance, Leo walked to the piano. He lifted the fall board, revealing the black and white keys. He wiped his dusty hands on his jeans and tentatively placed his fingers in position. He closed his eyes, listening to his father's guitar, and on the next cycle he joined in. His notes were clumsy at first, the timing slightly off, but the harmony was there. The two instruments, one wood and wire, the other hammers and strings, found each other in the quiet room. They played the simple song for minutes that stretched into an eternity. It was a duet of forgiveness. Every chord from Arthur's guitar said, "I remember who you are." Every hesitant note from Leo's piano answered, "I am trying to remember too." The music spoke of shared grief, of foolish mistakes, and of the stubborn, resilient bass notes of love that had been humming beneath the discord all along. When the final chord faded, the silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty or heavy with accusation. It was full, resonant with the shared language they had just rediscovered. Leo's hands rested on the keys, his shoulders slumped not with exhaustion but with the release of a burden he had carried for far too long. Arthur placed the guitar back on its stand with the care of a priest handling a sacred relic. He looked at his son, truly looked at him, and saw not the Wall Street shark or the foolish manipulated boy, but just Leo, his son. The song was over, but the silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty, it was full of possibilities. For the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel haunted. It felt like home again. The diner meeting was not a cure, but a diagnosis. It laid the wound open, cleaned it of the poison of deceit and resentment, but the careful, tender work of healing had yet to begin. Weeks passed. The check Arthur had returned sat on Leo's dresser in his small Queens apartment, a constant, silent reminder of both his failure and his father's faith. Arthur, back in Cold Spring Harbor, continued his quiet routines, but a subtle shift had occurred. The house felt less like a mausoleum and more like a space simply waiting. The silence was less about absence and more about anticipation. One crisp Saturday morning, with the autumn light slanting into his workshop, Arthur looked at his collection of well-worn tools hanging neatly on the pegboard wall. He picked up his phone. "Leo," he began without preamble, "the stool that went with your mother's guitar. It was just a simple thing. It got knocked around in the move to the shop and back. It's seen better days." He paused, the hesitation a tangible thing over the phone line. "Your mother restored that guitar herself, piece by piece. I thought, maybe we should make something for it. A proper stool, something worthy of it." The silence on the other end was long. Arthur could hear the distant rumble of the elevated train, the soundtrack to his son's new life. "I don't know how to build anything, Dad," Leo finally said, his voice laced with the shame of his own perceived incompetence. "I do," Arthur replied simply. "I'll teach you. Be here next Saturday, 8 a.m. That first weekend in the garage was a study in awkwardness. The space, smelling of sawdust, oil, and time, was Arthur's sanctuary. To Leo, it was an alien world. He stood uncertainly amidst the table saws and drill presses, his clean, soft hands a stark contrast to the scarred, capable hands of his father. Arthur was in his element, a quiet general commanding an army of familiar tools. He laid out the plans he had sketched on graph paper, the lines precise and elegant. "We'll use cherry wood," Arthur said, running his hand over a smooth plank. "Your mother loved the color of it." Their first attempts were clumsy. Leo held the wood for the first cut, his grip too tight, his body tense. Arthur had to gently reposition his hands, his touch a strange, new form of communication between them. Leo's first attempt to drive a screw went crooked, marring the wood. A flash of his old frustration crossed his face, the anger of a man used to immediate, quantifiable results. "It's not a stock trade, Leo," Arthur said, his voice calm, not chiding. "You can't bully the wood. You have to listen to it, feel the grain." Oh, slowly, painstakingly, a rhythm began to emerge. They were a strange duet, the old engineer and the former financier. Arthur would demonstrate, his movements economical and certain, and Leo would follow, his initial clumsiness gradually giving way to a focused concentration he had previously only reserved for market analysis. The air filled with the rasp of sandpaper, the whir of the drill, the sharp, clean scent of cut cherry. They were not just building a stool. They were learning a new language, one spoken not in words, but in shared effort and precise measurements. During their breaks, sitting on overturned buckets and sipping coffee from thermoses, they began to talk. The conversations were simple, islands of words in an ocean of focused work. "So, the moving business," Arthur said, looking at his son's calloused palms. "It's hard work." Leo rotated his sore shoulder and gave a small, weary smile. "It is, but it's real. You pick something up, you put it down where it's supposed to go. End of the day, you know what you've done. No one gets hurt." The unspoken comparison to his old life hung in the air. He told his father about his tiny apartment, about learning to cook for himself, about the strange anonymity of his new life, a life where no one knew his name or the spectacular heights from which he had fallen. Arthur, in turn, shared small memories of Eleanor that the work unearthed. "She picked out this wood stain herself," he said one afternoon, holding up a can. "She used it on the old bookshelf in the living room, said it reminded her of a sunset. Through the sanding and staining, the joining and the finishing, the pieces of the stool came together, and so did the pieces of their relationship. The silences were no longer awkward but companionable. The small technical arguments over angles and finishes were not conflicts but collaborations." Leo, who had once viewed his father's quiet, methodical life with a kind of pitying contempt, now saw the deep, satisfying wisdom in it. He saw the pride in creating something beautiful and functional with one's own hands. Arthur, who had feared his son's soul was lost to a world of empty ambition, saw a man humbled but not broken, a man capable of patience, effort, and a quiet, newfound strength. On the final weekend, they brought the finished piece into the music room. It was beautiful. The cherry wood glowed with a warm reddish luster, its simple, elegant lines a perfect complement to the aged grace of the Martin guitar. Together they polished it with beeswax until it shone. They stood back, side by side, looking at their shared creation with a quiet, profound pride. "There's one last thing to do," Arthur said. They drove into the city together, to Sam's shop on Bleecker Street. This time there was no shame, no transaction. It was a recovery. Leo walked into the shop, his head held high, and shook Sam Roth's hand. Together, father and son carefully wrapped the Martin guitar in its case. Leo carried it out to the car, his touch gentle, reverent. Back home, they placed the guitar on its stand, in its rightful place, and set the new stool before it. The music room was whole again. The instrument, the stand, the stool, a trinity of memory, restoration, and creation. But both men knew that simply having it all there was not enough. The guitar sat beautiful and intact, a silent, waiting vessel. It needs to be played. And that, they both understood, was a much greater challenge. I guess 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe, even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you? And where are you listening? For 3 weeks, the Martin guitar sat on its stand in the center of the music room, a monument to a peace treaty that had been signed but not yet tested. It rested alongside the cherry wood stool that Arthur and Leo had crafted together, the smell of beeswax and lemon oil mingling with the room's perennial scent of old sheet music and the boxwood hedge just outside the window. The room was perfectly staged. It was beautiful. It was complete, and it was utterly, suffocatingly silent. Leo came over on Sundays now. He drove his rattling Honda Civic from Queens, arriving at 10 in the morning with a bag of bagels and the Times. He looked different. The soft, frantic energy of his Wall Street days had been burned away, replaced by a leaner, quieter demeanor. He moved with a stiffness in his lower back, the badge of honor from his job at the moving company, and his hands, once manicured and soft, were now rough, etched with small cuts and capped with thick calluses. They fell into a routine. They drank coffee in the kitchen, discussing the mundane logistics of life, the leak in Arthur's gutters, the eccentricities of Leo's landlord, the traffic on the Long Island Expressway. They were rebuilding their relationship using the safe, neutral building blocks of domesticity. But there was a line drawn in the hardwood floor of the hallway, an invisible boundary neither man dared to cross. They would walk past the open door of the music room. Leo's eyes would dart toward the guitar, a flash of visceral longing mixed with a crushing, nauseating guilt. That instrument wasn't just wood and wire, it was the scene of the crime. It was the tangible representation of the lowest moment of his life. The moment he had bartered his mother's soul for a weekend in Paris, with a woman who had never loved him. To touch it felt like a sacrilege. Arthur, for his part, watched his son orbit the room like a moth afraid of a flame. He understood the hesitation. He knew that building the stool had been the easy part. It was engineering, it was carpentry, it was solvable, bringing the music back that was alchemy. That required a vulnerability that neither of them was sure they possessed anymore. The silence in the house, once a heavy shroud of grief, had mutated into a breathless anticipation. It was a held breath, waiting to be exhaled. It was a late Sunday afternoon in November when the stalemate finally broke. The light was failing, casting long, melancholy shadows across the lawn, turning the waters of Cold Spring Harbor a deep, bruised purple. They had finished an early dinner and were clearing the table, the clatter of silverware loud in the quiet kitchen. Arthur dried his hands on a dish towel, folding it with methodical precision. He didn't look at Leo. "The humidity in the house has stabilized," he said, his voice conversational as if discussing the thermostat. "It's good for the spruce top." Leo froze, a plate halfway to the cabinet. He knew what was coming. Arthur turned and walked out of the kitchen down the hallway. He didn't stop at the living room. He walked straight into the music room and sat down on the cherry wood stool. He didn't pick up the guitar. He just sat there, hands on his knees, surrounded by the gathering dusk, and waited. It took Leo 5 minutes to follow him. 5 minutes of standing in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter, fighting the urge to grab his keys and drive back to the anonymity of Queens. He looked at his hands, the hands of a mover, stained with dust and cardboard. They felt clumsy, unworthy. When he finally walked to the doorway of the music room, his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Arthur looked up. His expression was unreadable, stripped of judgment, stripped of anger. It was just a father, waiting. "Your mother," Arthur said softly, the words hanging in the dust motes, dancing in the final rays of sun, spent a whole summer transcribing Debussy for the guitar. "Do you remember? She loved the challenge of it." Leo nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He remembered. He remembered the scratch of her pencil on paper, her brow furrowed in concentration, the sudden bursts of laughter when she finally cracked a difficult chord progression. Arthur stood up slowly and stepped away from the stool. He gestured toward it, a simple invitation, an abyss. Leo walked into the room. The air felt different here, charged, heavier. He sat on the stool. It felt solid beneath him, a comforting testament to the work they had done together. He reached out and took the Martin from its stand. It felt alien in his hands. It was lighter than he remembered, yet it carried a terrifying psychological weight. He settled it on his knee, the familiar curve of the body fitting against him like a lost puzzle piece. He smelled the rosewood, the aged spruce, and beneath it all the faint, lingering trace of his mother's perfume. He raised his hands to the fretboard. His fingers felt like sausages, thick, stiff, and unresponsive. The calluses on his fingertips, earned from gripping boxes and furniture, made it impossible to feel the strings properly. "I can't," Leo whispered, his voice cracking. He stared at his ruined hands, a hot flush of shame burning up his neck. "Dad, I can't. Look at my hands. I don't have the touch anymore. I'll just... I'll ruin it. It was a confession of more than just musical ineptitude. It was an admission of how far he had fallen, how thoroughly he believed he had destroyed the best parts of himself. Arthur didn't say a word. He didn't offer platitudes about it being like riding a bike. He moved behind Leo. He reached around and placed his own hands older, veiled in veins but steady over Leo's on the neck of the guitar. It was an intimate, jarring contact. Leo flinched, then stilled. Arthur gently manipulated Leo's stiff fingers, pressing them down onto the strings in a C major shape. "You don't need the touch yet," Arthur murmured, his breath warm near Leo's ear. "You just need to begin." Arthur pulled his hands away, leaving Leo's fingers locked in place. "Play." Leo took a shaky breath and strummed. It was awful. He didn't press hard enough on the B string, causing a harsh, metallic buzz that ripped through the quiet room. His rhythm was jerky, his attack too aggressive. It was an ugly, stumbling sound. Leo squeezed his eyes shut, ready to put the guitar down, ready to apologize and flee. But Arthur didn't recoil. He didn't criticize. He moved around to face Leo, pulling up the old ottoman to sit opposite him. He began to tap a slow, steady rhythm on his own knees. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. "Ignore the buzzing," Arthur commanded gently. "Just feel the wood. Find the pulse. Try the transcription she taught you. The opening." Leo took a deep breath, trying to quiet the screaming voice of self-hatred in his head. He focused on his father's steady tapping. He visualized the sheet music his mother had written out by hand all those years ago. He moved his left hand, finding the shapes. He plucked the strings with his right. The first few notes were hesitant, whisper quiet, as if afraid to disturb the air. But they were the right notes. A delicate, arpeggiated sequence began to emerge from the instrument. It was shaky, lacking the fluidity and grace Eleanor had possessed, but the melody was recognizable. Arthur stopped tapping. He began to hum. It was a low, resonant sound, finding the bass notes that underpinned the melody, weaving a foundation beneath Leo's faltering high-wire act. They were playing together. It was not a virtuoso performance. A music critic would have winced at the missed tempo, the occasional buzz of an improperly fretted string, the stiffness in Leo's phrasing. But in that room, in that moment, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. It was a conversation without words. With every plucked note, Leo was saying, "I am sorry. I am trying. I remember her." And with every low, humming, steady note, Arthur was answering, "I know. I am here. We are still here." The music bridged the chasm between the Midtown skyscraper and the Queen's moving truck, between the silent, grieving widower and the calculating engineer of revenge. It flowed over the scar on the floorboard, over the years of misunderstanding, over the grief that had almost drowned them both. It was Eleanor's voice, speaking through them, binding them back together with the fragile, resilient threads of melody. Leo played, and as he did, he felt the tension in his shoulders begin to unspool. Tears pricked behind his eyelids, blurring his vision of the fretboard, but he didn't stop. He let the music wash over him, cleansing him of the pretense, the ambition, the shame. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to be someone else. He was just Leo, playing his mother's guitar for his father as the sun went down. The piece came to its end, the final chord ringing out, shimmering in the twilight before fading into a profound, vibrating silence. Neither man moved for a long time. The room held the memory of the sound, a physical presence. Finally, Leo exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to expel the last of the tension from his body. He lowered the guitar, resting his forearms on its body, his head bowed. Arthur leaned back on the ottoman. He looked at his son, really looked at him. He saw the exhaustion, the humility, but also a flicker of something that hadn't been there before: peace. The shadows had completely swallowed the corners of the room. The only light came from the street lamp outside, casting a pale geometric shape across the rug. "Your timing on the bridge was rushing a bit," Arthur said. His voice was thick with emotion, but his tone was matter-of-fact, the critical ear of the audiophile returning. Leo lifted his head. He looked at his father, and a small, genuine smile broke through, cracking the mask of his weariness. It was a tentative smile, but it reached his eyes. "My calluses were getting in the way of the high E," Leo countered, his voice rasping. We'll get some finer gauge strings next week, Arthur said, standing up and stretching, his joints popping in the quiet. Easier on the fingers until you get the feel back. It was a mundane statement, practical and forward-looking. Next week. It implied a future. It implied a routine. Arthur walked to the wall and flipped the switch. Soft, warm light flooded the room, illuminating the rich grain of the cherry wood stool, the amber glow of the Martin guitar, and the two men sitting amidst the echoes. The house was no longer silent. It was full of notes, both the right ones and the wrong ones, full of history and mistakes and the messy, beautiful work of forgiveness. And for the first time since Eleanor had left them, it didn't feel like a museum of what they had lost. It felt, finally, like a home.